Hello, a warm welcome to everyone listening to this British Museum event from around the world. Thank you very much for joining us. If you have any questions during this discussion, please put them in the Q&A box and we will try to answer as many as possible after our presentations. Today, the discussion is about the Roman auxiliary fort at Vindolanda, near to Hadrian's Wall, and what it shows about life in the Roman army. This complements the British Museum's current exhibition on Legion life in the Roman army. So, to introduce our three distinguished expert speakers, first, Guy de la Bédoyère, a British historian who has published widely on Roman Britain and has appeared regularly on Channel 4's hit TV series Time Team. In 1999, Guy presented a three-part series, The Romans in Britain, for BBC Two and the Open University. He has published extensively on various Roman topics. Secondly, Barbara Birley, curator of the Vindolanda Trust and of displays at the Roman Army Museum. Barbara researches and publishes on Roman material culture. Thirdly, Adrian Goldsworthy, a British historian and novelist, whose books include The Roman Army at War, 100 BC to AD 200, and Roman Warfare. Most pertinently, he has written a number of series of fiction on Roman Britain, including the book called Vindolanda. Adrian has also broadcast on the History Channel. So, shall we kick off with Guy? And he is going to tell us about life and leisure on the Roman frontier. Guy.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. I hope you'll find this an interesting presentation. I'm going to talk about some of the background part, the everyday life, if you will, of soldiers on and their families, or the very large number of people who were involved with the Roman army in Britain. Now, if I go to my first slide here, this is a coin struck in Rome in the year 143. And some of you, if you live in Britain, might recognize it as the figure of Britannia, which, of course, used to appear on the 50-pence piece, and if you're a little bit older, you might just be able to remember it appearing on the penny. And it was derived from this Roman figure of Britannia. The Romans loved personifications, and this is their depiction of the province of Britain. And this isn't the defeated Britannia, this is the Romanized province of Britain. This is Britannia as a militarized female personification. If you look there, she's holding a military standard in her right hand, and in her left, she is clutching a spear. She's sitting next to a shield and on a pile of armaments. And this is how the Romans saw Britain, because it was exceptionally heavily garrisoned for a Roman province, since it was so remote. Now, this is a drawing not of Vindolanda, but of a Hadrian's Wall fort called Housesteads. There we are, nearly repeating Vindolanda there. Housesteads, which is quite close to Vindolanda. And this drawing shows the fort with its collection of buildings right in the middle, the headquarters building, the various barrack blocks. But the fort is only the heart of a much bigger and wider Roman settlement in almost every case. Around these forts are civilian settlements. And the soldiers who were here, and let's emphasize the fact that this is not the world of the legionary on Hadrian's Wall. Although legionaries might have built many of these facilities, actually they're largely manned by provincial soldiers, auxiliaries who've joined the Roman army for a career and in the long run hope to get citizenship. And they gather around them all sorts of other people, which means women, of course, who join them there, but traders. Families grow up around here. You have to see these places not as just military settlements, but as the settlement of a whole Roman way of life. Now, I'm going to look at this chap here, who isn't actually from the Roman military frontier, right up in the north. This is from slightly earlier in Roman Britain's history, but he's a really interesting person because he tells us where he came from and what his unit was. You see, the Roman army on the frontier are units drawn from all over the Roman world. So they might be from Gaul or Spain, or in this case, Thracians. He's a cavalry trooper in a Thracian unit. But he actually tells us he's a Frisiavoni tribesman, which means he really came from northwestern Europe on the coast of the North Sea and the English Channel. And what that means is that actually a lot of these ethnic identities are what you might call pseudo-ethnicity. There's even an instance, for example, of the Batavian cavalry in the Roman army. One of the Roman historians called Cassius Dio actually tells us that because Batavians were said to be such great cavalrymen, the unit is just named Batavian to give it a kind of great branding, if you like. It doesn't mean the soldiers in it all came from Batavia. And that's why this chap here, Sextus Valerius Genialis, is so interesting, because he's providing us with that essential information about where he came from. And other evidence that pops up from all over the Roman world tells us how many different places these people came from. If we look here, I wanted to give a hint of Hadrian's Wall. This is the sort of thing you might think of soldiers just fighting and wielding swords. Actually, they had to spend a great deal of time on the northern frontier building facilities. This is Limestone Corner, the ditch from the front of Hadrian's Wall. And these Lewis holes here in this great big stone was supposed to be to wrench this stone out of the ditch as part of building Hadrian's Wall. And you can see they've just given up on the job. They've said, oh, to hell with this, we can't do it any longer. They've just left it there. So you have to bear in mind the fact that soldiers are spending a huge amount of time doing this kind of heavy work. They might also be enjoying a leisurely hour or two in the latrine in the fort at Vindolanda, or in this case in Housesteads. The seats are missing, but you can imagine all the soldiers in here coming in, long hard day, relieving themselves, if you will. And then the little trough that you can see around the side, that's where they would lean down with sponges and dip the sponges in there to wipe their nether regions, and then the water would carry on flowing round and wash away the sewage which ran out of the corner of the fort. And that is where, of course, they could spend some leisure. Now, these soldiers I've mentioned had families. I put up here the Emperor Septimius Severus on a coin because he was the emperor who legitimized having families for soldiers. But it was already the case by then that loads of soldiers had families, even completely unofficial ones. Now, this is really one of the most famous documents of all. Everybody talks about it. I almost didn't bother to put it in here because so many people mention it. It is the famous birthday invitation from the fort at Vindolanda. And if you're familiar with that, well, you will know that this is a couple of officers' wives. One is writing to another, not her sister, even though she uses the word sister, that's a term of endearment. And she's called Claudia Severa, and she's writing to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina, asking her over to join for a party. And she mentions her child. Now, what most people don't bother to observe with this is, if you look into Roman life in general, because she's got a very small child, the likelihood is that these two women are in fact teenagers. They're probably 15 or 16 years old, because that's how young you might get married as a woman, a young woman in the Roman world. So this is, if you like, almost a teen sleepover. And it's a very precarious existence. They are trying to maintain polite existence right out on the Roman frontier. They aren't from Rome. They are probably from a province because of the commanding officers of the provincial units that they're in. But there they are trying to maintain some sort of civilization, but they're probably not mature women. And that makes it a very interesting side to the Roman world, very different from our own. And just an indication of how precarious things could be. This is from Bird Oswald Fort, further up the wall. And we have here the tombstone of a little boy who is the child of the tribune, the commanding officer of the unit there on Hadrian's Wall. And it says he lived for 1 year and 5 days. A tragedy from the Roman world, and probably one of all too many losses that would have been experienced at that time, particularly out in such a difficult environment. This, of course, as I said, is the commanding officer, but lots of other soldiers would have had small children, and they would have been accustomed to it. And what I love about this is, well, it's a tragic story, of course, is that what we have here, just these few words, it's like throwing open a window on the life of being in the Roman army and the fact that there were families there. This is from York. Now, this does actually happen to be a legionary tombstone, and we have not of actually the legionary soldier, but it is this legionary soldier's family, and he's here commemorating his wife, who's just shy of 40 years old when she died. And you can see also that there are 2 children who died at less than 2 years old, and of course that doesn't match with the images on the tombstone at all. And the reason for that is that this has been bought off the shelf. But here essentially is a Roman legionary who is a veteran of the 6th Legion, and he's had to say goodbye to his wife and both his children. Now, I mentioned earlier the idea of maintaining a polite existence on the wall, and this is from Vindolanda. It's a writing exercise, perhaps for a child, perhaps for a young person. It's a literary exercise, and it comes from Virgil's famous poem, the Aeneid, Interea pavidam volitans penata per urbem, which means, meanwhile, through the terrified city, fluttering the winged. And the noun for winged is fame, which is actually in the next line, and that's not there. So actually, as it stands, it doesn't make sense. So there were probably more lines below. And this is somebody practicing literacy. And it's worth bearing in mind that Roman soldiers are amongst the most literate people in the Roman world. That's why they have left such a vast record of written records. And this is a rebel emperor called Carausius, and he relied on military support. And this coin has a direct reference to Virgil's Aeneid on the back, and that wouldn't have worked unless the soldiers he was certainly appealing to had not recognized what he was talking to. Expectate veni ocun, the awaited one, which comes out of the Aeneid. Now, we've got lots of families and plenty of evidence from the wall and around the northern frontier for this. But this is surely another one of the most famous stones. And this is from South Shields, from the supply fort called Arbea. And we have a very interesting little story here. This is set up by Barates from Palmyra. He came from Syria, but was clearly with the Roman army in northern Britain. And it would appear that he had found himself a slave girl called Regina, which means queen. And he has bought her, and then he's freed her and married her. And there are a number of other instances in the Roman world of people like this. And this young woman was British. So he's found her in Britain. And there's a number of examples of where soldiers buy slave girls who they've taken a fancy to, free them and marry them. And yet the tragedy for Barates is that she died at the age of 30. And sadly, we don't have her face off the tombstone, but he's commissioned a lovely Syrian-style tombstone to commemorate his lost wife. And from the same fort very nearby is another completely different couple. Oh, is it a couple? Who knows? This is Victor, who's a Moorish tribesman, which means he's from North Africa, and he's been buried by his former master, Numerianus, who is a cavalryman with the Asturians. Now, this is such an expensive and elaborate tombstone. It has often been suggested that Victor was Numerianus's catamite, and that evidently, whatever the relationship was, it was being conducted openly in those times, up front, and it's a most unusual example from the Roman frontier. Claudia Severa and Sulpicia Lepidina's husbands exchanged correspondence about hunting, another completely different leisure activity in the northern frontier. And this tombstone comes from County Durham, and it actually commemorates the success of a military officer who has managed to capture a wild boar that all his many other officers have been trying to hunt out and kill. He's run it down, and he's so proud he has set up a dedication to the divinities of the emperors and the god Sylvanus to commemorate his wonderful deed. So that's another side to the northern frontier, is military officers darting away from their forts, rushing over the hills of northern Britain and hunting down things like wild boars. There is, of course, religion. That's another major activity. This is the official religion, Jupiter Optimus Maximus, from a fort at Maryport on the Cumbrian coast. Dedications every year to these are the state cults, but many of the Roman soldiers on the wall have other interests. So from Benwell on Hadrian's Wall, we have the shrine of Antenositicus, a little tiny temple dedicated by a few Roman soldiers, and there's the head of the god Antenositicus, who appears to be some sort of Celtic variant god. And perhaps the most interesting one of those is from the fort of Carabrough on Hadrian's Wall. And this is the nymph Coventina. And her shrine was a spring, not a temple. And into it, thousands of offerings were made in the form of coins and knickknacks and inscriptions and reliefs, all which were discovered in the 19th century. And this particular one on the left, you can see, was dedicated by the commanding officer there. But there are dozens of other pieces. For example, this little it's like a little incense burner, which was made by a soldier called Saturninus Gabinius, presumably he's a soldier, and he's spent his spare time making that, and he's thrown that into Coventina. Some of the others only open to men, especially in the late 2nd into the 3rd century, took up with the Persian mystery cult of Mithras. Very appealing to men because a lot of initiation ceremonies to get into this. It's a congregational religion, and this is just outside the corner of the fort at Carabroth and Hadrian's Wall, and a number of these installations are known up there. These are a couple of statues or reliefs, if you will, from the Mithraic temple there, and there's a huge amount of religious life going along on Hadrian's Wall and the whole of the northern frontier all the way through this time. It's one of the most thriving activities, and it's also one of the best ways that we find out about individual soldiers, because so often it's their offerings to the deities, whether to Coventina or to Mithras or to Ansenositicus or a whole host of other cults along the wall, that make such an enormous difference to our understanding about the individuals, the units they were in, the time that they were there. And those go alongside, of course, with the tombstones that I've already mentioned. And it's a thrilling reminder, I think, to just how complicated the world is up there. This isn't simply a world of soldiers, but it is a dangerous one. And this is a very, very unusual example of a tombstone. It comes from Ambleside. And this is a father and a son who were both in the army. But look what happened to the second one. Flavius Romanus Actarius, which means he's a kind of administrative person, lived for 35 years, killed in the fort by enemies. So although there was a lot of time for life and leisure, there is also all the time this background, this jeopardy, if you will, of being on the edge of the Roman world. And finally, my favourite, from High Rochester, which is an outpost fort on Hadrian's Wall, a wonderfully crude representation of Venus and her handmaidens, perhaps carved by a soldier. It accords to the classical concept, the setting, but this is highly provincial, perhaps made by someone at the fort as part of his leisure time. So there we are. That's my little very rapid tour through life and leisure on the northern frontier. I'm now going to hand over to Barbara, and I hope very much that you have enjoyed what I've been talking about, and I'm sure Barbara will excite us now. Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much. That was really very interesting. I'm sure the birthday party invitation might come up more than once tonight. But what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is talk to you about Vindolanda and looking at the letters and the artifacts and kind of bringing those together and how we can kind of start to decode what was left for us in the past. So without further ado, I just wanted to give a few slides that would help us to understand where Vindolanda is within its historical context. So Vindolanda is older than Hadrian's Wall. It is part of the frontier system known as the Staingate frontier, and it was established in about 85 AD. And then you can see it there along that blue line that definitely goes from Corbridge through to Carlisle. And we assume that the lines of those roads would have actually extended along further, probably towards both coasts. It continues to be occupied throughout the building and garrisoning of Hadrian's Wall. But by the time Vindolanda is still established, Hadrian's Wall is there being built. It's already on fort number 5. So we have at least 5 forts. And this next slide, I'm not going to test you on this information, but I think it's a really good way for us to actually see all of the different periods of the site and the complexity of the archaeology as we look at it. So we have over 14 different periods on the site. This is an ongoing process, and who knows what we're going to find in the future. But this also gives us the garrisons that we actually know and the modern countries from which they come from. Most of our soldiers are not from the Italian peninsula. They're from places like Belgium, the Netherlands. We do have some Varduli cavalry from northern Spain, and also soldiers from France and northern France. We also have periods where we don't know where they're actually from yet, but we'll keep working on that. Who knows, maybe next year we'll find out. I also wanted to just show the kind of complexity of how long we've been working on the site. On the left-hand side of this slide, the black and white photo, you can see the kind of snaking long line just to the right of that photo. That's actually the Staingate Road as it follows just along the north of the site. And the playing card shape of the fort. Now this is back in 1969, so right before the Vindolanda Trust was established in 1970. And you'll see that there have been some excavations in the 1930s. You can see the headquarters building in the center and a few of the gates, the north and the west gate there. The other image, the color image, was just taken last year, almost about a year ago. It was April of last year. And you'll see the same sort of area, the plain carriage shape of the fort, and then the extramural settlement outside of that. Now, this is what it looks like for 50 plus years of excavations. But remember that we actually have not only the kind of one plane that we're looking at here, but actually it goes down up to 6 meters in different places. And that's where you get those 14 different layers of archaeology. When you get down to those really deep layers, and we will be talking about quite a few of the objects that come from these first kind of 5 to 6 forts of the site, we get what's called anaerobic conditions, oxygen-free conditions, and that means that everything survives. That means everything from the organic remains of leather, wood, all sorts of different pieces actually survive. It does mean that there's always a bit of a water management sort of situation on the excavations because we're underneath the actual water table. So it does take quite a lot of maintaining and working to get through these areas. But we do get some fabulous different types of artifacts. And please, I hope that people are able to not only look at our website, but actually hopefully come to visit us as well to see some of these, because I am not going to be able to talk about all of them in the short period of time I have with you tonight. We get things one would expect, things like pottery, lots of amounts of pottery. We get things that our soldiers would have used, things like daggers, and not too many, but we do have a couple of swords. We get everyday objects like the knife that would be used by everyone. Things that are kind of special, like the griffin mount that I have here, but also the organic objects, like the wooden hair comb. It looks like a knit comb. I am almost completely sure that that's exactly what they would have used them for. And of course, we get the boots and shoes. That's one of the things that Vindolanda is very well known for. We have over 5,000 shoes within the collection, so it is quite a big collection of boots and shoes from almost every period on the site. But one of the things that we're best known for would be the writing tablets. Now, these are thin pieces of wood. Guy has actually kind of mentioned them already. Thin pieces of wood. They're actually kind of a tree ring, and they flattened them out, and then they actually took and wrote on them in like a dip and scratch ink pen. And the first one, which is this one, was found back in 1973. And when it was first found, we didn't know what it really was. And it has to be photographed with infrared photography in order to see the black ink come up. And that's because there's carbon base in the ink. And we've been working recently with the British Museum to better understand the processes in the woods that are being used to create these tablets. But what I love about this tablet is that this is about real people. It's not about the kings, the queens, the emperors, anything like that. It's about the real people like me if I had been living in the Roman period. It says, I've sent you pairs of socks, a couple pairs of sandals, and some underpants. And when you're talking about archaeology and wanting to get down to the nitty-gritty of what people were like, I think underpants is pretty much as close as you can get. Now, we haven't found any underpants yet, but we have found a child's sock. This is made of textile. It's a woven textile, probably 2 scraps that have been actually put together in order to kind of form around the foot. The only piece of complete textile, we do have other fragments of textile from the collection. And then we're starting to piece together who these people actually were, because we not only get the writing tablets that are mentioning them, but we also get the objects that relate to them. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about Tagamas, because I think he's a really interesting character. We have him in this writing tablet found in 2001. And it references Tagamas Vexillarius, which means Tagamas the standard bearer, and he's ordering lances or spears. And this was found in the Scola, or the kind of officer's mess, so we know that he's a non-commissioned officer. But in the room next door, we also found this amphora handle, and the amphora handle actually has been carved with the name Tagamas. And we believe that they are 2 of the same person. And we know that the amphora handle would have held olive stewed in wine, which was a rather tasty tidbit, and that he probably didn't trust the other soldiers because he actually wrote his name on it saying, "This is mine." I think we've probably all been in shared accommodation somewhere in our lives that we would have had to write our names on our really kind of posh imported goods that we didn't want anyone else to have. I think it's also interesting as you look at the kind of translation is that the Romans have a fabulous way of kind of naming the other people that are having things ordered for them or the accounting. So I love that there's Victor the huntsman. One would assume that there was probably another Victor that wasn't a huntsman. So you can start to figure out characters and maybe start to almost paint pictures about what they were like. We have another writing tablet. Now, this one was found back in 1988 that refers to Tagamas. And I think this one's really interesting because it tells us that he's a Vardulian cavalryman. So we know that he's from northern Spain. But what is really incredibly interesting is it says the companion of Tagamas. Now, we know from the other tablet, because we had Victor the Hunter, or even in this tablet, we have Vitalis the Bathman, or the veterinarian is named as Alio. So we're starting to get these names and then their jobs. But when you say the companion of Tagamas, there's an inference that it was probably his woman, his common law wife, because if it was another soldier, they would have used that name. So we're starting to see that maybe even though he wasn't allowed to marry, he is probably an older soldier because that's how he's got to the rank that he's at, that he probably would have had somebody that he decided to stay and lead his life with. So we're starting to build up this picture of a community of people that are living here. Now, I said we'd come back and we'd look at this one again. I want to just add a little bit more information to what Guy had said about this writing tablet. It is probably the most famous. It dates to about 97 to 105. So this is a time before Hadrian's Wall is actually built. And it is to invite Claudia Severa, who's at the fort of Brugge. She's the commanding officer's wife of Aelius Brocchus, to her friend, Lepidina, who is the wife of Flavius Carialis here at Vindolanda. He's the commanding officer of the 9th cohort of Batavians from the modern Netherlands. And I just love the way that she says, come to my birthday celebrations to make my day more enjoyable by your presence. I think that's absolutely lovely. And then greets her husband, and her husband greets Lepidina and her sons. We would possibly not so formally, but we probably say same types of things today in emails or other text messages that we use. But the important thing for me is that most of this letter was actually written by a professional scribe. But down in the right-hand corner, there's a different handwriting. And the experts can tell that these are different handwritings. It's a different type of script. And it's assumed that it's probably her adding her own personal greeting. So I will expect you, sister, farewell, sister, my dearest soul, as I hope to prosper, and greetings. That is written by a woman who is literate, living here on the frontier nearly 2,000 years ago. And I think if you look at what history is the kind of form of actually writing things down. So for women's history here in Britain, this is one of the very first examples that we see of that. So very important. And just to give an idea of what kind of women and children were actually living here on site, remember I said that there was about 5,000 shoes. I just wanted to show a few images of other shoes. This is a woman's boot. This is a lovely woman's shoe that's actually right now at the British Museum on display in Legion. And this is a fabulous shoe on display here at Vindolanda. This one is from Lepidina's household. It's a very, very delicately made shoe, possibly Lepidina's. We don't know for sure. Here's some children's shoes because, of course, as Guy was saying, that there's probably women and children. They kind of come together when you have men. So you'll get a lot of children's objects as well. These are on display down at the British Museum. And this lovely little one. Now, this is a tiny little shoe, probably a first walker for a little toddler. But I think it's amazing the amount of time and energy that they have spent in order to make sure that this is a beautiful shoe. The child wouldn't have worn it more than maybe a few months because they would have grown out of it. So again, this is starting to look at some of the socioeconomics of the site, who these people were and how much disposable income they had. Back to the archaeology of the site, this is just to show that sort of demographic of who was actually living in the fort. So the red dots are for adult males footwear. This is our period 4 barrack. And in the blue dots, it shows non-adult males. So these are kind of women, children, and adolescents. Some of those are kind of hard to kind of draw the lines in between. But it shows that I think we'll all agree there's more blue dots than red dots. So it shows the diversity of people that are living in and around the fort. I can also say that during certain time periods, up to almost 45% of the shoes that we have from different periods are actually from this women, children, and adolescents. So it's a huge kind of variety of people that are living here. What else do we have that relates to women? Well, this one is from the Lepidina archive, and she's writing to Paterna, or actually Paterna's writing to her, and she's bringing her some fever remedies. So these aren't hugely surprising for women to be looking at this type of thing. And here's a little pepper pot. We call it a pepper pot. It could have held any sort of very precious spices or cosmetics. There's no less than 20 tablets mentioning Lepidina, including 7 correspondence with Claudia Severa and 4 just greetings to Cerealis' wife. Things about Lepidina's birthday, also kind of meetings between Flavius Cerealis and Aelius Brachus. So these are they sound like two couples that like to have their Saturnalia or their midwinter festival, but also come and stay for the new year. So these are people that are socializing. And also that Valletta is asking Cerealis to relax the kind of severity as Lepidina has asked. And I think these are showing that Lepidina is very much a mover and shaker. She's into those politics and helping people around the site on behalf of her husband. So she's very much involved in what's going on. Just the last few slides here. I just wanted to show that we are still finding tablets. These were found last year, one which was found in the last 15 minutes worth of excavations, and hopefully we'll continue to be able to share and spread more information about them. And then I just wanted to say thank you. We are going to be looking at a new 5-year program starting this year, and you'll be able to come along and see the excavations, more information at our website. And we're into the 2nd year of a 5-year program at our Roman site of Magna. And if you want to know more about the writing tablets, please go on and look at Roman inscriptions in Britain. There's a lot of really good information there as well. Thank you. And now I'd like to hand over to Adrian. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, we're certainly going to be looking at some of those, the same writing tablets again, because they are just so interesting. Now, my day job for all my adult life has been studying the Roman world and in particular the Roman army. But as a sideline, I write these stories. And what I've tried to do is take all the things I've learned, all the things that scholars are discovering all the time about the army, and try to present a vision of that world as to how it may have been. Because when you're a historian or an archaeologist, you have to admit, for instance, with the Lepidina slipper, the shoe, that it's found within the household, and she's the most distinguished lady there at the time, but we can't actually say it was hers. Now, in a novel, you can't have a character open a door and step into nothing. So you have to go past it, remove that scholarly instinct, which is to say, oh, well, I'm not quite sure, and this is how the evidence points, and actually lump for something. So I've written a series of novels of Vindolanda stories, which, oh, right, I have now lost my control for the slides. So if we could move on to the next one, please. Sorry, there we go. Once again, the birthday invitation. And if we leap onto that, we'll actually have the text again. This is the inspiration for the first of the Vindolanda stories. So it's one of those things that as soon as a lot of these were relatively new when I was starting out as to study, and there is something very exciting, and Vindolanda and hopefully the Cavour and Magna will prove to be the same. There's always something every year that makes you stop and think, wow, I didn't expect that. Or the writing tablets are particularly interesting because I'm a historian on the basis of, so texts are very much my thing. But if you're studying the Roman army, you can't do that. No, that's not, oh, there we go, right. Aha, that's better. Right. So now we've got onto the text of it, which again, we've read several times. I'm not going to comment on too much, but I should say at this point, although I've tried to present as accurate a view of this world as possible, the stories are set from AD 98 onwards, because again, we can look at the periods of the fort, but I've actually, for a story, it's got to happen on a particular day, a particular month, of a particular year to make sense. And so you have to plump for something, which means that you're using the archaeology in a way that it's not really designed to be used, in that dating is rarely very precise. We will talk about something as late Flavian, which means up to the death of the Emperor Domitian in 96, or early Trajanic, he's the emperor who succeeds to the throne in 98. That's fine, but if you're you're writing a novel, and within that world, you need to know whether something is physically there at the time of your story. So we've already mentioned the Staingate Road, which is the military route, the road along which forts like Vindolanda are built in the generation or so before Hadrian's Wall. And we don't actually know when the Staingate Road was turned into a more formal Roman road as we understand it. So I have, in the first story that takes place in 98, it's simply a trackway that the army's been using as maintaining in places, and the road is built during the course of the stories. But I think one of the themes that both Guy and Barbara have brought out very well is it's rather misleading when we talk of somewhere like Vindolanda as a fort. And in our imagination, fort immediately implies something very military, a defensive fortification. And of course, Vindolanda has got that. It's got walls, it's got towers, but it isn't like a medieval castle. If you look at a castle, it's the walls, the turrets, the keep, the moat, all of these things jump out at you. Those are the dominant features. If you look at a Roman site like Vindolanda or Housesteads, Guy showed us that picture earlier, what jumps out to you is the accommodation, the places where people live. The barrack blocks, the commander's house, the bathhouse outside, the vicus, the group of civilian buildings that are outside every Roman fort. And it's best to think of these not really as forts, but as garrison towns. This is largely where the army lives. It isn't, on the whole, where the army plans to fight. But Roman soldiers are joining up for 25 years. Somewhere like northern Britain clearly has military issues, military problems going on. Again, Guy showed us the indication of one possibly from Ambleside, but the sheer fact that you put this number of Roman soldiers within this small area for a very long time, they're there before Hadrian's Wall, you then, for whatever reason, Hadrian builds this wall, you have the Antonine Wall later on, but Hadrian's Wall is occupied for centuries. A big chunk of the Roman garrison of Britain, which is a heavily garrisoned province, as Guy pointed out, is concentrated in the north. And there has to be a reason for that. But in terms of the wider histories of what's going on in the Roman Empire, we're told very, very little about what's happening in Britain. Now, the Vindolanda material reflects the everyday life because, like so much archaeological material, it's the things that are discarded, the things that are thrown away. In Vindolanda, because of the sequence of forts, and Barbara, a better place to tell you than myself, but so much is preserved because the Romans demolish one fort to build the next one rather casually, and they tend to seal a lot in, which means that it's preserved. And the writing tablets are the ones that people weren't bothering to take away with them to keep in their permanent archive. So you have some with traces of burning that have been, some was trying to dispose of them, but they didn't do a very good job. So they're telling you about the everyday. Now, my stories are not intended to be profound literature and insights into the human condition. They are basically, I would describe them as Westerns just set in the Roman world and on a Roman frontier rather than one on the plains of America in the 19th century. So although I'm interested in this world and trying to reflect that, I can't have my characters sitting around doing not very much for the course of 100,000 words because that's not going to be very exciting to read. So bad stuff tends to happen. And the premise of the first story is that old Lepidina is on her way to visit Claudia Severa for this birthday party, and she and her escort get ambushed by a raiding party of a people from the north, and that's how the story develops. But it's worth, as part of thinking about that, this is the reconstructed dining room from the commander's house at South Shields. The period of Sulpicia Lepidina and Flavia Cerealis at Vindolanda, you're still dealing with a timber fort. This is before everything is rebuilt in stone, which happens later. The first 3 forts are all timber. And it gives you an idea of the social world of people like this. Now, one of the writing tablets, Cerealis talks about their ridula. It's the sort of diminutive form of the coach, the rider. This nice reconstructed example is in the museum at Cologne of a Roman period coach. We have to think about these people again. Guy's given us this idea of these sort of young mothers having to uproot the family and taking them with the husbands, with the whole household, to the fringe of the Roman Empire. Because Vindolanda is very much in these early years, this is the edge of this is almost where the Roman world stops. And yet it's clear from the material found there, from the writing tablets, that it's fully plugged into Roman culture, the Roman economy. They can get luxury goods there. They can wear designer shoes. They can have fancy material. They can eat and drink of the best. It's all part of this. One thing that we sometimes forget is that without the writing tablets, we have no other evidence for the existence of Flavia Cerealis, Sulpicia Lepidina, Brocchus, Claudia Severa. Many of the people mentioned, they only appear in this. In the same way, we have other individuals who will appear in a single inscription from somewhere in the Roman world. But Sulpicia Lepidina, Flavia Cerealis, they are equestrians. That's the social rank that's just below the Senate in the Roman world. Now, whereas there are 600 or so senators, and at least in the 1st and 2nd centuries, at any one time, there are usually about 4 of these senators and 3 would-be senators in Britain, which reminds us of how important Britain is, even though it can seem like a poor relation and it can seem to be on the fringes, and the Roman Empire is very big. There are tens of thousands of equestrians at the very least, and they are people of considerable status, but they're sort of country gentry, perhaps, rather than the high aristocrats. But they are going for these commands where someone will be in a post for several years. The average we tend to quote is 3 years in a job like this, though, there's a lot of guesswork within that. So it is actually worth taking the whole family and uprooting and moving to every fort like Vindolanda has a house built for the commander and his family that compares, fairly favorably with a decent house in Pompeii in size. Obviously, it's timber early on. Later on, you'll get your underfloor heating and your private bathhouse, which are difficult to put into a timber environment, but you can build it in the stone phases. So you've got these people who are out there living, trying to live the sort of life they would live in the provinces of the rest of the empire. Again, we've already mentioned this one. I think Barbara cited it, where you've got a chap called Claudia Severa who's apologizing because he couldn't go to a birthday party. But you've got this sense of people living the social life that they would like to live wherever they were in the Roman Empire, and they're doing it very successfully. These are, of course, this is the top of the pyramid at somewhere like Vindolanda. This is the commander and his wife and other officers, and they seem to be socializing to a fair degree with people of similar status, though clearly they're also there and there are obligations with other people who are there as well. Again, we've already mentioned this one, but the letter of Valata, who's probably a woman judging from the name, asking Cerealis for a favor, but expecting her connection with Lepidina, that she will speak on his behalf. Now, this is so very Roman. This is characteristic of the ancient world in general, but the Roman Empire works on recommendation. This is my friend, do this on behalf of me, and I'll count it as a good favor to me personally, and therefore I will owe you a favor in return. So again, this is a woman who is the commander's wife, but she is acting as an important social figure. And again, it's right here on the edge of the empire. Now, obviously, here are attempts to reconstruct the Roman army in a more familiar sense. This is the Ermine Street Guard in one of their displays. You've got cavalry, you've got legionaries, you've got the testudo. In one sense, the cavalry are more appropriate for someone like Vindolanda because the cavalry are auxiliaries rather than the legionaries. But you're doing this at any stage in archaeological work. In here, you've got a Willowford East, one of the turrets on Hadrian's wall. The billboard that's next to it is showing a painting reconstructing what it would look like. You can see on the left what's there today, or as it's been conserved. But how do we reconstruct? We're adding from the remains we have, and we're trying to reconstruct a three-dimensional world in which people are living their lives and doing lots of things. This one is another one. I'll just say the last thing probably about Cerealis, but this is a nice one. And it's famous really for the line near the bottom where my comrades have no beer, please arrange for some to be sent. Seems to be a report from a decurion. That's a cavalry officer, junior to somebody like Cerealis, who's in charge of the whole cohort of Batavians. Now, the Batavians are from the Netherlands, from Holland, as we've seen mentioned already. And the historian Tacitus and Senator mentions that they had the right to be commanded by their own aristocrats when they served in the Roman army, and they provided men rather than paying taxes to the Roman army. Traditionally, we'd always thought that this stops after AD 70 because the Batavians had ended up being on the wrong side in the Roman Civil War, a lot of the units, and then they'd actually rebelled and declared an empire of the Gauls. And the assumption was that this then stops this practice. They're just part of the regular Roman army. They're mixed up like any other unit, and they're commanded by any equestrian. Flavius Cerealis, from his name, does appear to be a Batavian because Flavius is the name of the Emperor Vespasian, who wins that civil war, and Cerealis is the man who subsequently governs Roman Britain, but at this time is the relative of Vespasian, who is sent to suppress the revolt of the Batavians. So Cerealis is presumably the descendant of either a father or grandfather who gets Roman citizenship as a result of either changing sides during that rebellion early enough to get rewarded for it, or he never rebelled at all. He remains loyal. But in this, a decurion, who's perhaps a Batavian himself, refers to him as his king, not to his officer, not to his commander, but Regi Suo, my king. And that's interesting. Now, obviously, when the editors came to look at this writing tablet, they decided, well, this is probably just somebody being rather sycophantic and groveling to his commanding officer and just expressing that. But I found it quite interesting, and I explore this in the novel, the idea that you may still have a Batavian aristocrat, which you clearly have with Cerealis there, and it's quite possible that you're from the royal line of a tribe. So within a unit that's part of the regular Roman army, there are other relationships that might well be going on. And this is something I can explore in a novel. Obviously, you can't prove, but it's interesting to look at some of these ideas as possibilities. Again, just I'll mention this. We've got this chap, Annius Equester, a centuria regionarius, centurion responsible for his region. My whole premise, my main character in the story is a chap called Ferox, who is a centuria regionarius, and we hear about these in Egypt, and there's one recorded at Bath. He's a sort of, because they're Westerns, he's basically the army scout stroke marshal situation. Again, based on a Vindolanda tablet and a nice display in the Carvoran Museum. One thing to emphasize is, although the garrison is based at Vindolanda, that doesn't mean everybody stays there 365 days of the year. And in that particular strength report of a cohort that's there before the Batavians, then most of the unit is actually elsewhere. So remember, archaeological time is rather different to real time where people live, and that's what you're dealing with in novels. So again, adventures have to happen at that pace. So I better stop there because I'm going over time.
Thank you for that, Adrian. I have been asked if I will chair the questions, and we've had a number of fabulous questions that have come through. So I will try to kind of pick out some and hand them over to my colleagues as well, because some of them are easy for me to answer, as well as things that I've thought about. But I'm sure both Guy and Adrian will have bits that they would like to add to that. So our first question is, how many people would have been living at the fort? So that is a very good question, one we get quite often at Vindolanda. We would have, when it was one of the smaller forts, about 500 men. And then we go up to, at different time periods, having up to 1,000 men. That's given the kind of added extras that we would have to that, probably about 1,500 non-combatants, so tradespeople, men, women, children, that would have been living alongside of the actual soldiers, up to probably about 3,000 people when you have the 1,000 strong. And that's a conservative estimate of how many people would be living there. I would also just say, remember, it's only 2 miles as the crow flies to get to Housesteads. And so the military community that you would have had along Hadrian's Wall would be much more dense than what you have today, where we have lots of sheep and cows and kind of farms here and there. During the Roman period, there would be a lot of people and a lot of different languages and a lot of things going on. I don't know the answer to the question to this question, so I'll see if either Guy or Adrian do. And the question is, do we know anything about the portable altar recently found at Birley, the inscription translation? I haven't heard anything about that yet. I don't know if either of you have.
No, but we can throw in a comment on that, which is that the whole military zone on the northern frontier has produced a gigantic number of religious dedications, and many of them are clearly one-offs, produced by people for themselves. They're often very crudely carved little altars, and the way that it was working is normally what it says on the altar is it's the fulfillment of a vow, what someone has done. It's the end bit of the relationship, if you will. Someone has asked for something from the god, which could be really very trivial. We know that from Bath. It could be because someone's nicked your money, that therefore you want them to die, and that's what some of the requests are, and those turn up in the sacred spring at Bath. And if you feel you've had satisfaction from the god, what you would then do is you would fulfill your vow to the god by making a little altar offering. And then, like the Saturninus one I showed from the Coventina Spring, you're fulfilling the vow to the god. You're paying your half of the contract. The god has given you what you wanted. You now give an offering to the god in fulfillment. And it's normally that bit that we find on Hadrian's Wall.
Thank you. Adrian, maybe you'd like to take this one, because the reality is we will never know. But what sort of food would they have had at the famous birthday party?
Ah. Oh, right. Well, as I say, in my story, she doesn't get there. Unfortunately, it's all the striking. I mean, one of the main concerns in the writing tablets, there are a lot of lists of deliveries, purchases of food. Cerealis seems to be very fond of eggs, so that they crop up a lot in quite a. But you've got the supplemented by the hunting, which of course we've talked about as well. But there's the striking thing, as I say, is that you can buy just about anything. There seems to be available. So, and you do have oyster shells and this sort of thing will turn up again quite frequently. So it's not. There are luxury, prestigious items that only officers can afford, but there's quite a lot of other stuff as well that everybody can, and that must have been transported there. The Roman pattern is generally lots of courses, and you sort of have a bit of this and you have a bit of that, and of course you're reclining on the triclinia, the three couches, as we saw the picture earlier from South Shields. So it's very much, while I'm sure there would be an emphasis on, and you do get different patterns of bone finds and things between towns and legionary bases and forts and this sort of thing, most of what people would eat anywhere in the Roman Empire was available, but with obviously some things are locally far more easily sourced than others.
Let's just throw in there, if I can, Adrian, that of course the transport, they do have all this material, but it's a pretty precarious route. There's that famous tablet from Vindolanda, which says "Dum viae male sunt," while the roads are bad. So it's all very well talking about the Romans with their wonderful road system and efficient, but actually there's a great struggle to get that stuff out there, and it's a mark of the Roman world that their persistence and resilience that they get this material to a place like Vindolanda. Even under the conditions, it's a very different place from today. It's a wild, inhospitable place, even with Roman roads struggling through it.
I don't know if I would say that. I live up here, so
I went to university. I went to university up there in the 1970s. I can assure you, it was a very brutal place.
Right. Our next question is, what would the griffin mount be used for? That was the small copper alloy griffin mount, and that's a really good question. We don't know. It is definitely mounted onto something. We can see that from the actual artifact. Griffins were often seen as keepers of treasure, so it's a lovely little object that maybe was held for something that was important. We have a question for Guy here. Would any Roman soldiers from Melandra near Glossop been sent to Hadrian's Wall? I don't know if you know an answer to that one.
Well, there's no straightforward answer to that, because usually when we know about a soldier, we know about him from only one particular surviving reference. The vast majority of soldiers, of course, there is no record of their lives. And therefore, we have to piece together a much bigger picture from a tiny number. But what we do know is that it is undoubtedly the case that an individual soldier in a provincial, an auxiliary unit in the Roman army might expect to be sent to dozens of different places throughout his career, and he might be transferred to different units. So that is undoubtedly the case, because we do have some pockets of evidence of where units are in one part of the Roman world and then later on they're somewhere else. So if we get back to the famous birthday party invitation, it's unlikely, for example, that those commanding officers would have been up there for more than a few years before being transferred to somewhere else.
Yeah, I would add to that it probably depends on the time period, because we see in our forts, some of them are very short-lived.
Yeah.
And of course, into the later periods, they do get quite a much longer period. But
well, they seem to settle down much more towards the
yes,
end. The communities become much more established as they have intermarried with local women. That becomes absolutely their home, even if they had antecedents who'd come from somewhere else, either in Britain or from beyond. But by the 3rd or 4th century, they're much more likely to have been really quite established there.
And one thing we can see, and it's well illustrated in the exhibition as well, is that the army is keeping track of where everybody is. So they know very precisely where they are, what they're doing, what they've come from. All of this is recorded, even to the extent of animals coming into the army. Mules, horses are recorded as well, and they're passed and approved. So the army has this documentation, which you see partly reflected in the Vindolanda tablets or in the papyri from Egypt and elsewhere. So it is all controlled in the same way that for substantial periods, these auxiliary soldiers, wherever they've come from, at the end of that 25 years, get Roman citizenship. And they're added to the census list. So
you mentioned the strength report, of course, which lists a very large number of soldiers off sick or that they're stationed elsewhere. And it is back to that question about whether somebody from Melandra, further down in the province of Britain, if you went to London during the Roman period, you would have found dozens, if not hundreds of soldiers stationed in London, serving on the bodyguard of the provincial governor. And London had its own fort. And we don't know anything about the actual units were there, but there are tombstones and other records of individual soldiers in London. So there's no doubt about the fact that you might find yourself detached off on that job, or for example, going off to be on the bodyguard of a commanding officer of a legion in Britain. So lots of different career opportunities.
I think we have time for just maybe one more question. And I think there's a question a little bit around kind of schools and children, or kind of women of high status have slaves or servants in their houses, that type of thing. I think that there's a couple of different interesting things there. We don't have any evidence at Vindolanda of school, but I think you would have been educated by what you were going to do. I don't know if Guy or Adrian would like to come in, but I'll just answer the second one. We have lots of evidence of slaves and servants here at Vindolanda, including writing tablets written by slaves. Yeah. Would either of you like to add anything to that?
Well, there is as I mentioned, the little section of the Virgil's Aeneid, which, if you jump forward to the 17th or 18th century, you would have been expected to copy out and memorize passages of Shakespeare. So back in antiquity, you would, as a child, if you're but probably a boy, you're more likely as a boy to be educated, and you're also only more likely to be educated if you are an officer's child. But it is no doubt, if you go to the late 3rd century and an imperial biography, there is a reference to the fact that soldiers were the most likely to be the ones recognized in popular life for quoting from the classics. So to the extent that they are a cliched character appearing on the stage within plays. So there's definitely the case that in Roman popular culture, people believed that soldiers were generally more likely to be familiar with classical literature, more likely to spout it out at opportune moments. And there are a number of instances of that. And that does suggest that the whole milieu of the Roman military, and that probably includes their families, as I said earlier, are more likely to be educated than the rest of the population. And the evidence from Egypt shows that particularly.
And part of that, as you mentioned earlier, the army is very literate. You know, there has all these documents are being kept. And again, you can look at the Terentianus, which they've got in the exhibition, where a man has joined up and gets a plum posting to headquarters rather than being outside breaking rocks with his comrades. One question we're not sure about, but there is some Egyptian evidence suggesting it, is does the army teach people to read and write? Because it needs all these scribes. So but that then begs the question, who are you recruiting? How literate are they likely to be? And, you know, you wonder, are you scrawling? It's notable that of the quotes of the Aeneid, that is just about the most frequently quoted piece of Latin literature, they're nearly all from books 1 to 6. So that seems to be on the sort of the curriculum. And after that, nobody knows so much. So it's a little bit like the way, you know, Shakespeare's plays, everybody does Antony and Cleopatra or Caesar, but some of the more obscure ones don't get there. So it's possible. I mean, I have a scene in one of the stories where you hear in the background this class of troops sort of reciting things in that way that children will, doing it. But again, it's just exploring an idea. The evidence isn't quite there for us to say definitely the army's doing this, but it would make sense because they do need all these people capable of producing many of the writing tablets and many of the papyri.
Right. That's fascinating. I think we're going to stop that there because I think we could probably have questions and chats for the rest of the evening. But we'll stop it there and I'll hand back over to Hilary.
Well, many thanks to all of our speakers, Guy, Barbara, and Adrian, for a really fascinating and stimulating discussion. Thank you so much for making it really so interesting. And thank you, our listeners, for joining us for this British Museum event. And we very much look forward to welcoming you back soon. Full details are on the British Museum website. So if you want to know what the next event is, details are there. But for the moment, until the next time, goodbye from us all and goodbye from the British Museum. Goodbye.